I will now call this meeting to order. But first, we will have a statement from Isaac Peterson.
Thank you, Chair, members of the Commission. Just a brief notification for those that are watching online, just because we received word that our Channel 8 streaming service wasn't connecting with the city system, or there's some interplay going on. So the meeting will still be streamed live on YouTube, but it just isn't being broadcasted on Channel 8 right now due to a technical difficulty. So that's all I got, Mr. Chair.
Very good. Thank you, Isaac. Our next order of business is to adopt the agenda for tonight's meeting. Commissioners, is there a motion to adopt the final agenda?
Make a motion to adopt the agenda.
Thank you. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Very good. Thank you. Those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. The motion does carry. Our next order of business is to adopt the minutes from the July 19th, 2022 Planning Commission meeting. Commissioners, is there a motion to approve the minutes?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes of the July 19th, 2022.
Excellent. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Very good. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. The motion does carry. Our next item is item 3.1. Amendments to Victoria Zoning Code Section 20, off-street parking and loading, downtown west subzone scheduled parking requirements. Our first discussion item on our agenda tonight is item 3.1. Consider amendments to the Victoria Zone Code Section 20, off-street parking and loading. This item does include a public hearing. I will now turn it over to City Planner Isaac Peterson for a staff presentation. Isaac?
Thank you, Chair, members of the Commission. As the Chair noted, tonight we'll be holding a public hearing and reviewing proposed ordinance amendments to Section 20 with reference to downtown west subzone scheduled parking requirement that's proposed to be incorporated into code. So just as a little bit of background rehashing how we got here. So on July 19th and July 25th, the Planning Commission reviewed and provided recommendations on the Downtown West Phase 1 development proposal, which proposed a 145-unit multifamily apartment building. As the Commission is aware, the site did not meet existing multifamily parking code requirements at the time, and through that, at the time, the Commission considered a parking ordinance amendment and reviewed that, and recommended approval ultimately of the development proposal with the condition that the site meet a future ordinance amendment pertaining to the site. The City Council also approved with conditions the proposed development and noted that through a condition of approval that the site meet a future code amendment to facilitate the development, noting that it be specific to the downtown west portion of the central business district. So at that time, the City Council directed the Planning Commission and staff to develop a parking ordinance amendment specific to downtown west, in part to facilitate the project's conditional approval. So on August 16th, as the Planning Commission is aware, we reviewed a draft ordinance amendment orientated towards the Council's direction. At that meeting, the Planning Commission provided some feedback, and I'm just summarizing here broadly, that there's generally favorable towards a 1.5 parking space requirement per unit within downtown west. There's some request for a 1 parking space per bedroom scheduled parking requirement, and alternative code language based on the Kimley Horn market recommendation parking study that was provided. There's also some general concurrence to limit requests for off-street parking spaces by multifamily development proposals to shared parking spaces located immediately next to the subject property rather than a ratio or a percentage. And there is some request for consideration for parking feasibility, some of the broader impact to the downtown west development site as a whole. So staff's tried to incorporate those recommendations into a revised proposed ordinance amendment for your consideration for recommendation to the City Council. And that's what we'll be reviewing here this evening to receive recommendation feedback from the Planning Commission and hold a public hearing regarding the amendment. So just on that latter point, and based on the Planning Commission's discussion at the last meeting, wanted to provide some of that broader overview of the Downtown West feasibility study that was conducted in 2019-2020. At that time, the City Council authorized infrastructure feasibility study that looked at street alignments, site grading access, other utilities like stormwater management, trails, sidewalks, and parking on the site as a whole through the process of reviewing the Downtown West development site. So within that feasibility study, about 400, just a hair under 400 total dwelling units were contemplated within the Downtown West development area, and about 33,000 square feet of retail was contemplated on the whole development site across 8 buildings on the totality of the 13.5 acres. So with respect to parking, there's about 680 total parking spaces noted within that feasibility study to serve the area. Of those spaces, about 248 were off-street spaces, 52 were on-street spaces, and 380 were anticipated to be covered structured spaces. This is what that looks like. So from the feasibility study, you see our areas. There's proposed building 5, which became the Downtown West Phase 1 building that we're looking at. You can obviously note that the proposal has changed periodically over time from the time of the feasibility study. So there's, at that time, 125 units contemplated. Currently, we're looking at 145. And there's 13 on-site parking spaces noted, some street parking further along the Steiger Lake Lane extension to the north, and then some on-site spaces for future building additions. So subsequent to the feasibility study being considered by the city then went out and reviewed concept plan proposals from developers. This is the one that the city selected to move forward with, which you can probably tell by just looking at it, incorporated a lot of the elements and general structure of the Kimley Horn feasibility study. We see our Phase 1 area with the central green, the Phase 1 building that we've been discussing recently, and then the remainder of the site. So I've just kind of noted in these other areas kind of what it was broadly contemplated for through the feasibility study in terms of land use. I do want to say with the footnote that, of course, those land uses, the intensity of those land uses could of course change over time based on the direction the city wants to go. So proposed building 4 that's noted was contemplated as senior or residential with mixed use retail, so about 5,000 square feet of retail, around 80 units of some form of residential development. Building 7, about 60 units of residential development with 10,000 square feet of retail were contemplated. Building 6 along Highway 5 noted about 33 units of residential and 26,000 square feet of retail or second floor retail located within the building, and then again 74 units of residential, and then some townhomes on the north side along Steiger Lake Lane. So of course, concept plan has evolved over time based on development proposal through that. And this is kind of what we're looking at today and recently through the development of that initial phase into downtown west, the Central Green, some expanded parking, and then on-street parking along the entirety of Steiger Lake Lane leading up to the site. So at the time of the Kimley Horn feasibility study, there was 13 surface parking spaces identified on the Phase 1 project property. There's slightly less dwelling units at that time as well. And then there's 42 total public shared parking spaces shown on the Central Green. So currently, with the Downtown West Phase 1 proposal has been contemplated, there are 98 shared parking spaces located on street along Steiger Lake Lane leading up to the site, and 46 parking spaces located on street, and 52 spaces located within the Central Green. So that's a net increase within the development area from feasibility study to where we're at today, about 52 on-street parking spaces that were not contemplated at the time of the feasibility study, and 4 additional parking spaces within the Central Green. So with respect, and this is largely driven by the Downtown West Phase 1 development proposal, just to remind the commission of what's broadly being proposed. 145 dwelling unit apartment building is the proposal that the Planning Commission and Council has reviewed. That building consists of studio, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, and 3 bedroom units. And then along with that, there are 178 structured underground parking spaces located off street to serve the apartment building. That's an increase of 1 from the time of when we last spoke, trying to really squeeze out every inch of that structured parking that we could find, and we asked the developer to do that, and they found 1 spot. And then again, the 98 public parking spaces, shared parking spaces with Downtown West Phase 1. So of those public spaces, 47 are immediately adjacent to the building. So as the commission is aware, there is a parking demand study provided with the project proposal. That parking demand study identified a ratio of about 1.33 parking spaces per unit, or around 1 per bedroom, to serve the building parking demand for a total of 194 spaces. And again, there's 178 structured underground parking spaces proposed on site, which is 16 less than the anticipated demand noted within the parking demand study. So bringing it back for where we're currently at with our code. So the current city zoning code prescribes that multiple family dwelling buildings, the land use, requires 2 parking spaces per dwelling unit, with 1 of the 2 to be enclosed. And it currently, I'll spare you me reading the entirety of the code requirement, but it prohibits the shared use of public parking spaces with development to serve a development for residential land uses. So as noted, there is public parking being constructed in tandem with the proposed apartment building. And it's really been contemplated and designed for shared use with the building and adjacent uses. So modification of the code would be required to facilitate the shared use of parking due to the shortage that we're looking at and deviation from the code. So based on the Planning Commission's last discussion, and some feedback from the city attorney, we've tweaked some of our language a little bit to try to cover our bases here. And I'm going to go over some of those. The first change from the last time we did this was really just for clarification and consistency within the code. Previously, we're identifying 1 subzone we did receive a recommendation we're identifying one subzone of parking for downtown west. We should identify what the remainder of the central business district is. So we've tried to do that here and feel very confident in the proposed language that we have, which does add the added language describing what the subzones are. So it notes, in order to more closely address parking demand within established parking requirements, the city has identified 2 subzones within the central business district. And further, the following subzones shall make up the central business district and are graphically represented on the central business district map adopted by reference. So noting subzone A, the downtown district, and then subzone B, what we recognize as the downtown west district. So this would apply just to parking. And then further, based on the noted use for shared parking, altering some of the language found in section 20-7 as shown on the screen here. And then again, the revised central business district map noting where the subzones are located. So subzone A, the downtown district, so all of the central business district, excluding subzone B, which is just that downtown west area. So further, based on some of the general concurrence with the Planning Commission at your last meeting, we've revised the scheduled parking requirement found in section 20-6 to note that 1.5 spaces per dwelling unit would be required for multifamily residential uses within the downtown west subzone, with one of the 1.5 spaces to be enclosed per unit. So 1 per unit enclosed, 1.5 per unit total. And then noting that available shared parking immediately abutting a subject site can be utilized to accommodate required parking spaces pursuant to the City Council approving the request to utilize shared parking as provided in sections 20-7. So with that 1.5 proposed amendment that we have before you here this evening, that would necessitate 218 parking spaces to serve the development site to conform with the code. So to meet that requirement, the shared use of 40 public parking spaces located immediately adjacent to the subject property would be necessary to provide with the code, to comply with the code. Of those 40 parking spaces, the overnight use of 16 of the shared parking spaces would be desired by the developer to comply with that anticipated parking demand based on the provided parking demand study. So the balance of available shared parking located within the downtown west project area, within that phase 1 area, would be 51 shared parking spaces, and that's exclusive to future on-street public parking spaces that would be pursued through subsequent development over time. With respect to the overnight use of 16 of the shared parking spaces, I just want to kind of footnote here this evening, the Planning Commission isn't making a determination on where those shared parking spaces are. I did note in my staff report, and I'll note it again here, if this is pursued, the location of those 16 shared overnight use parking spaces, staff would recommend that they be located within the central green area. And I'll pull that up here. And this is just a graphic, and you can't really read the writing on here, but it's also within your packet. To comply with the code in practice, the development would be requesting use of spots noted in orange immediately adjacent to the building. So the 21 parking spaces next to the building to demonstrate proof of parking, but not overnight parking or exclusive use parking, shared parking. And then 16 spaces would be requested within the central green, immediately adjacent to the building entrance to serve as overnight parking next to the development. So based on the commission's last discussion and some subsequent discussions, sounded like the commission was interested in reviewing an alternate code provision. So I've provided these simply as reference points in case that's the desire of the commission to form a recommendation. So the first was a 1 parking space per bedroom requirement, noting that 1 per dwelling unit be enclosed. So if applied to the downtown west phase 1 development, 191 parking spaces would be necessary to serve the site and meet the code requirement. Still anticipate that the allowable overnight use of 16 shared parking spaces would be desired by the development to serve the future building tenants in this scenario and meet that Kimley-Horn parking demand study recommendation. So if this alternative amendment scenario was pursued, the balance of available shared parking located within the project area would be 82 shared parking spaces, exclusive of future development down the line. So the second alternate parking requirement, based on the commission's last discussion that we looked at, was simply incorporating the Kimley-Horn study into like a written requirement within the code, which noted, different percentages of 1-bedroom and studio units and 1-bedroom units to kind of serve the full measure, which at the end of the day for this development site would equal out to about 1 per bedroom or 1.33 per dwelling unit to serve the site. So if this was pursued, that would result in the need for 194 parking spaces to serve the development site for this project, and would include the request for 16 additional shared parking spaces adjacent to the site. It would still necessitate overnight use of those 16 parking spaces. Staff would note that just based on kind of how pointed and specific the code language is, it may be a challenging one to administer down the line, just with varying dwelling unit types and all of that. All 3 options are certainly feasible and would work in practice with this development site if pursued down the line. So, Chair and members of the Commission, as noted, this item does require a public hearing. A public hearing was noticed in the August 25th edition of the Chan Villager. So this evening, the Planning Commission is being asked to provide a recommendation regarding the proposed ordinance amendment. If there is alternate language contemplated or desired by the Commission, the Planning Commission can certainly make provision through the Commission's recommendation to incorporate that language into a recommendation for the City Council's consideration and review. With that, I can stand for any questions, but I turn it back to you, Mr. Chair.
Well, thank you very much. I think what we'll do is we'll open the public hearing. And Mr. Gregory, would you like to address the commission? Would you like to read your statement?
No, that's fine. I'll just come up and if you're ready.
Sure.
Opening
Yep.
public hearing? Great.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you, Chairman and commission members. I'm opposed to this. I'm opposed to overnight parking on that whole 13 acres. I just think it's a bad idea. This is a TIF project. TIF project should bring real benefit to the community, assets to the community, assets that the community is looking for. This whole 13-acre site, the community wanted mixed use, okay? Mix of retail, commercial, residential. This building, when it started out 3 years ago, had first floor retail, okay? And then it evolved to, well, that might be tough to fill. We're gonna build it so that we can convert the first floor to retail, but we'll start off with residential. Okay, that was the second iteration. And now here we are where they've wiped that out and we're not gonna have any retail on this building at all, okay? So that's not bringing the benefit to the community that we were looking for. Okay, so we can do with that. But now, after 3 years of planning on this building, now there's, you know, according to whatever, whether it was studies or what, there's 16 spot shorts. So now, not only they're bringing benefit to the community, they want to use overnight parking to kind of clog up possible other people that want to bring retail. So I think that's a bad idea. I mean, if you think about it, if we were just drafting a brand new ordinance and we were at the very beginning stages of this, and we didn't have this proposal before us, I don't think any of us would support overnight parking. I don't think that would be the furthest thing from our mind, would be to have overnight parking. But here we are, because, you know, after 3 years of planning, we're short on parking, so now we want to put in parking. I think it's a bad idea. Could you bring up that last proposal with the green space? When we first looked at this, we were kind of all somewhat either led to believe, or maybe it was just me, but this green space was supposed to be kind of an access point to Three Rivers. This was going to be the entry point to the community from Three Rivers, hoping that Three Rivers would build trails to this spot and people could gather at this green space. They could drive there, bring their bikes, and launch their bikes from there, and somewhat of a trailhead. And then other things that we could gather there for too. So it was really supposed to be kind of a community gathering spot or a meeting point. And if we block this up with overnight parking, I just really believe that there's going to be very little turnover in those cars. Those cars are going to get parked there. Those are going to be second vehicles for people that live in the apartment, and you're not going to get the turnover. Those cars will be parked there for maybe days, weeks at a time. You just won't get the turnover. I just really, really would encourage you to not allow overnight parking in this area. I'm not that concerned about the shared parking. I think that's good, having the turnover, but I really hope we draw the line and we don't have overnight parking. I think it's really a mistake. It sets a precedent. It really doesn't take much imagination to see the next apartment building wanting the north half of that green space for their overnight parking. I'm just personally really, really against it, and I hope you join me and reject that idea. Include the 40 shared, no big deal, but the 16 overnight, I hope you erase that from the language on that. Thanks. That's all I'm gonna say.
Thank you.
Any questions? Thoughts? Yes, sir.
Well, if the overnight parking wasn't in the green and was on the street, would you have the same objections?
I don't think that that's going to help us out, because that's going to be closer to possible other retail area, I really think. I just think it's a bad precedent, and I really would encourage you to not allow overnight shared parking. I think it's just a bad look. I mean, it's going to be filled with snow, the cars aren't going to move. I just think it's a mistake all the way around, and I really believe that none of us would be contemplating this if this developer wasn't here, you know, requesting it. It's just a bad idea.
Well, I agree with the snow plowing is a bigger challenge on the street, but I don't know what retail would be coming close to that area. What other retail that parking would be clogging? I'm just trying to understand.
From in front of that building?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I see the green.
I mean, we have a parking problem here. We've been dealing with for 2 decades. We hear it all the time, and to launch our first project with a parking issue seems like we're asking for
what we know.
trouble. What?
It's what we know.
That's what we know. All right, thank you.
Could you just because for Keith, you're doing the minutes, could you state your address?
Yes, Tom Gregory, 1885 Steiger Lake Lane, just up the road from the road project.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Would the gentleman from Kraus Anderson like to speak to the commission?
Yeah, and I guess I'm here to support, answer any questions. I don't have anything formal to say. Mark McLean Development, Prior Lake. I can respond, I can answer any questions. You guys just tell me what you need from me. I'm here to support, kind of be of service, so.
Opportunity for questions.
Your original proposal said you wouldn't need any additional parking, right? It was all going to be self-contained?
Yeah, Chair, Commission members, thank you for the time this evening. Yeah, I do want to make that clarification. When we're talking about being short, that is not from our perspective. We feel like we're parked at an appropriate level. We're trying to find a happy medium with the ITE, with the technical data as it was gathered, with really trying to thinking about the future and trying to set this up for orderly, set it up for a good place, because you don't want to kind of do spot overlay parking districts, right? Even though I know the ordinance allows for some level of discretion on a case-by-case basis in the nuance of it. But that's what we're here to support. I think organically, from our perspective, as we look at our portfolio and our operations people, we feel like we'll be covered. The organic demand will be inside. There may be some of the, cross-shared parking stalls, or the daytime share parking stalls will be for guests and visitors that come and go, but not on a long-term basis. I think the actual resident demand that we've seen, and we're monitoring this pretty actively, kind of meets with what our structured stalls allow for. And then the addition of the organic demand for the additional of some convenience stalls and some daytime, folks that want to come tour the property for leasing reasons and things, call that 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 stalls probably at most is probably where the actual real demand is going to lie. Because I say it doesn't do us any good not having the appropriate level of parking for that tenant's or that resident's expectations. They just won't lease. I mean, there are a lot of folks that if they have to park outside just will not lease. I mean, that's the condition that we kind of deal with. So we need to make sure that we're covered internally. I look at that central green space too, and we also want to see it as a connection. We hope Three Rivers hears this, sees this as a catalyst to actually engage the reserve and not just kind of keep this separate but equal kind of distinction that the site has with it right now. But those stalls right there, if we're looking at really programming that central green, which we want to be a part of as well, we've talked at length about that before. I also look at those stalls and ask myself, who is going to be parking there overnight? And so when we work with staff on identifying if there is a couple that go overnight, because the demand is so excessive and that it goes out onto the street, right? And there has to be a few overnight parkers. Where does that want to go? It certainly doesn't want to be the street operationally. That never works right. So up in that central green area, we asked ourselves, fast forward 5 years down the road, who's going to be parking there overnight? So if it's efficient to have people that are going to be utilizing that space, I don't think are going to be staying or leaving their cars overnight. So that seems like a good optimization of infrastructure that we're all making investment in, using that overnight. But from our perspective, operationally, we do everything in our power to deter people from overnight parking to avoid exactly what you're talking about. We do not want that to be a low-cost alternative to a much more securely, operationally beneficial parking scenario that's in the garage, controlled, climate-controlled, and safe and secure. So I think we're in alignment not wanting to offer ample parking, and so we want to help craft an ordinance that works not only for this development but for the ones to come after it. But I do think, long answer, that organically, no, we're not. We would do this project without the necessity of those stalls if they weren't required by ordinance. Let's put it that way.
Very good. Other questions?
Can you talk a little bit about the design of an apartment complex for residential use for a lease situation with no residential or no lease parking, no guest parking, I just see, at some point you're making the design and that you're going to have 2 or 3 that need to be people coming in to lease, maybe even more in the initial stages. It just seems like, I just don't understand that, because I'd never seen, and maybe it was staff direction, I just don't understand. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think part of being the catalyst to get the infrastructure in, to get this development off the ground, because I know you guys have been working on it for a long, long time, right, was working within the framework of a master plan that had good bones to it. We loved the central green. We loved some of the things that were kind of in the early iterations of this master planning, knowing that there was a lot to like there, especially with the second, third, potentially fourth phases. It's a good master plan in the sense that the infrastructure made a lot of sense, especially with how things off Arboretum are going to need to be handled. It seemed like the most efficient way to kind of lay it out. Did not want to lose that amenity of the central green, because again, that's one of those things that on paper, a lot of times in master planning, things on paper look a lot better than they actually are in reality. I think this is an amenity, a community and civic amenity that can be programmed right and can be a really cool activated space. So essentially, we took a site that was not rectilinear, right? Couldn't really get kind of our optimized floor plates on and things like that, and just kind of fit into it. So we spent a lot of time, do we try to do something? And then we're picking up grade as we're going up the hill too, right? And so we spent a lot of time kind of reconfiguring buildings to try to see, could we get some surface parking, could we not? And ultimately what we're finding is, as long as the infrastructure improvements and the realignment was happening, the balance of the demand from a convenience parking standpoint really is going to be probably 6 to 8. Right? That's kind of what our equation is. The future guest resident parking, that's going to be, especially once lease up is over, very inconsistent and for very short terms, an hour, hour and a half at most kind of thing. And then the visitor parking, what we found in all of our other portfolio works in really nicely. We do a lot of horizontal mixed use stuff where we do a lot of cross share because it's nights and weekends. Generally, the balance of our visitor parking demand isn't going to be at 3 o'clock on a Monday. It's going to be after maybe the park is not being utilized or where there's street parking available. So we're moving away from the notion of kind of going big surface parking everywhere, and this site and the angles of it did not lay out well to do kind of a token surface lot. So we were just trying to bring a little bit more of going along with more of an urban village concept where we're going to try to get those parallel styles, know that, what we're seeing in our portfolio is the demand is not going to be there enough to do kind of that prototypical suburban striped parking lot.
Didn't your phase 1 design have the building turned with like 8 or 10 surface parking places in the front of the building?
Yeah, so there was a bunch of different iterations. That was a much smaller building too, and it did not work very well, and those stalls didn't work very well. The parking subgrade there would have been much, much lower on a per bedroom or a per unit basis. So this way we ended up getting the best parking plate we can, and we're getting 178 stalls in there, and I think the average, I'm gonna get kind of technical, the average parking stall per, with circulation, everything down there is less than 330 square feet. Typical development, typical parking plate, we're seeing like 380, 370, 380-ish. So we kind of reverse engineered what is the most efficient structured parking scenario we could do. So that's why we have that big plaza deck, because that's how we can get the most parking underground, fitting into the boundaries of the site. The other way around, even though it was less units, we were gonna have less structured, between the surface and the structured straws, which were just under the footprint, we were gonna end up getting less per dwelling unit than we did with kind of the better engineered parking plate under the building.
I just struggle with the common green parking paid for by the residents of Victoria, for the residents of Victoria, serving an apartment complex that's receiving TIF. To me, that's just really difficult. And I'm a taxpayer here. I'm gonna pay taxes for this, and that's a difficult one for me.
Just before we get into like too much deliberation, I'd recommend to the chair, members of the commission, to close the public hearing.
Yeah.
Before you get too far into it. Yep.
Very good. I was about 5 minutes away from that. Very good, thank you. Is there a motion to close the public hearing?
I'd like to make a motion to close the public hearing.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you, the motion does carry. Now we will have, with the two gentlemen here and the planning commission, Isaac, jump in.
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, I just want to make one quick point of clarity because there's discussion occurring about overnight parking and what that would look like. I want to be very clear to the commission. So there's no decision on the logistics of a shared parking agreement that would occur or result from this particular discussion tonight. Right now, we're looking at an ordinance amendment that could potentially result in requests. What that request would look like depends on what an ordinance amendment would look like. So I just want to be clear about that, and I can answer any questions.
Very good, thank you.
Based on the ordinance amendment, I mean, we're trying to calculate parking stalls, and with a CBD district, typically that always entails shared parking. I mean, we have it here. It's just, it goes hand in hand. So, I know that we're not here to talk about the shared parking and where the overnight parking is, but that's really, in my mind, the only question here.
Sure.
And where it's located. I have no problem with overnight parking. It's where it's located. And the reason why I say that is this is a special site. It's going to require density, and we've master planned it for a reason to create that. We just want to make sure that we protect the park area, the green areas that residents will want to use. If it's overly parked, people won't use it because they won't feel safe. So we got to think about that. So I have a quick question. So the feasibility study, how much retail was proposed in phase one? I didn't see anything that showed that.
Commissioner Moore, Chair, members of the commission, at the time of that feasibility study, there was no retail considered with that building 5.
Okay, so this is this is building 5.
Correct.
Okay. So quite honestly, the whole retail, I mean, if we're going to rely on that feasibility study, retail kind of goes out the window for this proposed project. Now, parking ratios, that's a separate thing. But we got to start somewhere. You know, we have to create some development for retailers to even envision what this is going to look like. So in my mind, I think the overnight parking, Commissioner Schwarting, where you suggested is where I think it should go personally. I mean, it is, I don't see retail going in that section. Now, from a snow plowing perspective and a, you know, that gives me pause and gives me a little concerned. I don't know how that's done well. I'd love it if someone could comment on that. Yeah.
Commissioner Moore, Chair, members of the commission, I want to hedge my comment on simply we haven't committed to developing like a shared use parking agreement or exactly where everything would go, just based on where we're at in a conversation, not to minimize its importance by any means. Part of staff's initial recommendation on where to locate potential overnight parking is very related to the maintenance element. Simply put, you know, if there is a maintenance agreement for shared parking use on the central green, it may be a little bit easier to manage. Like building operator is responsible for plowing shared use spaces adjacent to the building. Where we get into some concern is, again, that along the street, when the city's plow trucks are naturally going through there, it may be a little bit more trickier if there's overnight parking there to necessitate that. That doesn't necessarily preclude that there could be some overnight parking there, but there's several differing opinions that we've heard. But generally, because the central green parking spaces are not located on street, they're off-site, so to speak. It's where we'd contemplate or at this point recommend allowing overnight use if pursued. Isaac,
If you could help me kind of clarify some thinking. I I think everybody in the commission is leaning towards the concept of overnight parking is not generally desirable on the streets. So, for this particular section of downtown West, consideration might be made towards restricting overnight parking on city streets, period, so that everybody shares that same burden regardless of this developer or future developers. And then the remainder of the parking spaces that are in the green, that could be just simply taken off the table as, quote, available shared parking, correct? The city could just say that these spots are going to be designated for the green, and that by removing that, you remove the available shared parking, and then that would force any future developer to have to figure out how to develop the parking spaces that they need pursuant to the ordinance.
Correct, Commissioner Vansky, Chair, members of the commission. That's generally what the city could do. Of course, if there are shared parking spaces, you could ask the developer as well, but I think the intent behind those spaces would be that they would still be available for shared use, irregardless of the overnight use. But if that's kind of the in practice procedure that the city wanted to follow, city could absolutely say, we're not double dipping into these parking spaces, and it is what it is.
So would you then prepare, like, for lack of a better expression, an available parking roster so that, once you've gotten into an agreement, then click, we take those shared spaces off. Now there might be, we could get to conceivably a place where there's zero. And then the ordinance would then force the developer that's going to come along in the next project to say, I have no shared parking available to even try to meet the ordinance with the shared arrangement. I need to come up with all the spaces for myself.
That's correct.
So option one, then, once the, quote, available shared parking is exhausted, then that really sets the tone for future development having the highest standard to provide parking, which, again, as we come back around to it, always seems to be the most, the concept that we struggle with the greatest.
Mm-hmm. And I would add, Commissioner Vansky, Chair, members of the commission, that probably any subsequent request for shared parking is going to be dependent on the land use, right? So there could be a scenario, and through the feasibility study, there's about 10,000, don't quote me on that, about 10,000 square feet of retail contemplated on this building across the green. So it may make sense if there was a proposal down the line with a building next to the green to allow some retail shared use within the central green, or not. It kind of depends on what a future proposal would be, or what the city desired to be developed on that site, which of course the city controls.
When I look at our own situation here at Downtown West, and one of the points of reference that I've made is the downtown city of Excelsior, and the situation that they have going with parking. And, one of the, my own casual observation is that the one that really made out on downtown parking in Excelsior is the one that makes all of the many, many signs that are all over, that's restricting, so that delivery trucks can get in, so that, 2-hour parking, and then what appears to be a pretty effective system, this big electronic control panel for parking meters at the same time. And all of that, and we get there on kind of a regular basis. And all of that said, there's no room to park. I mean, it's seldom that one can find a place to park in downtown Excelsior. So we, on the planning commission, what we should be doing is preventatively, can we prevent, a situation like that? And how do we do that at the same time? I was a casual conversation with Isaac. We were talking about Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And we get down there on a kind of a regular basis from the other house. And you talk about a mess for parking. Well, there is no parking. I mean, the parking meters are filled. It's a very busy downtown business district area. And there's, I've spoken with a lot of other people. Well, they just go somewhere else. They don't bother with it. So we really do have, what I believe is a very major decision is how do we make this work? How do we make the parking portion of this whole project work?
Well, I think it's imperative after this project gets its approval, we restore the parking. We regard it and for retail, and we take away that parking. Let's just say hypothetically, we know that we want 10,000 square feet of retail. That's non-negotiable. We have to have 10,000. So then we calculate, okay, what's the maximum amount of parking that 10,000 square feet would need? And remove that from the equation for many other multifamily developers. In my mind, that's the only way to do it. Otherwise, we'll be left with nothing. We won't, that's just my opinion. I also think we have to gauge, and I would be very curious to hear what city staff is hearing from the retail community as far as like demand. Where do they want to be located? Do they want to be over there by the green? Or do they want to be in the building closer to Highway 5? Because that dictates a lot too, and how this is master planned. But I just think we have to really hold on to the parking for the retail. It's really, really important, because we'll be left with nothing if we don't.
Because that is a very well-defined objective that the city has, is commercial.
If I can just jump in, Chair, members of the commission. You have to really keep in mind that retail has changed the last few years, right? There's so many angles to retail. Not every retailer needs a ton of parking. We've got 2-day delivery. We've got instant pickup, supply change, labor changes. So when we talk retail, we may not need all these C's and C's of parking. If you're looking at all the Targets and Walmarts that are in the world today, a lot of them are developing right in their own parking lots because they have seen they don't need all that parking. So we need to sit down as staff and as a city and really and look at what retail we want. Because when you talk retail, are you talking big box retail? Or are you talking small boutiques, right? So there's different angles of retail that we really need to determine. And I feel very confident that we're not going to need C's and C's and C's of parking for that retail based on what we currently have here, right? We want retail that complements what we currently have and things that we don't have. Retail could also be a pharmacy. It could be medical. So that is a whole different use as well. So we really need to take a step back, I think, and work with the retail developer or work with someone that is an expert in that, because it has changed and it's going to change dramatically in the next few years as we come out of a pandemic again.
And then, Chair, members of the commission, I think I'd also add one of the items that that the city needs to do, right, and that we intend on doing in the next over the course of this late fall and winter is to re-engage with the community engagement more broadly with the community, and then the commission and city council, of course, as well, for what is that next step and what are those land uses that the city as a whole would like to see in a subsequent phase of development within downtown West. So kind of identifying what are the top 3 things, what are the top 3 retail types that the city would like to see moving down the line. I bet I could guess at least one of them. But re-engaging and kind of relining up the guardrails of, you know, hey, this is what we want to see, and if the city were to do like an RFP or something to that end, what would it actually say and request within a future phase?
I love the process. I'm also realistic. And many times, you know, a city can say, we want X use, we want this business, and it just doesn't happen. So we have to be prepared and we have to plan. And that's, I think, at the end of the day, we have to plan for a range of square footage and protect our parking to allow for this. Because if we just keep doing theoretical conversations, we won't be left with parking to accommodate these uses we'd like.
As a city, we know that we had a space that we would have loved to have been a grocery store, that was a grocery store, that every grocery store that looked at it said it didn't have enough parking. So now we're like, okay, if that doesn't have enough parking, and that was the grocery store space, and what the residents of Victoria truly have always said is they want a grocery store again, and if that goes out on Highway 5 or somewhere within the downtown west development, it needs to have ample parking to attract a grocery store, a small grocer, large grocer. I don't, you know, if that's really what the goal is. And it has to have easy in and out, which to me is probably closer to 5.
You guys want some feedback on that? I don't want
I'd love your feedback.
Yes.
You talk to grocers all the time, yeah.
we talk to every
I think that's a great
on this
idea.
site specifically, so I have pretty good real-time feedback.
That'd be great.
It's possible, just not right now. So we've had the luxury of working with staff for 3 years now, right? And so we've had like multiple iterations of this conversation. It feels like it's coming, right? There's still a little bit of, I would say, the general feedback without naming names. Some are more attentive in their feedback than others are, you know, kind of gauging that barometer. But it's been getting more attentive. There's still concern about, you know, we're just a little too close to one of our sister stores, or we're just that or the other. And it's the old cliche, we need a few more rooftops. I would say it's even beyond just pure rooftop counts. It's they need to see momentum on the site. Because when they drive by it now, they see a big wooded green site and they're like, no. And so we get a little bit of momentum going. We start getting that infrastructure in, things become real. We can show success through that momentum of like, look how amazingly desirable this community is. Look how quickly, how high in demand the barriers to entry, start setting that kind of narrative. You're exactly right. We wanted to take this edge of the hill kind of piece because that central, Commissioner Murray, you're exactly right. That central area is the protected. That is going to be your focal point, vertical mixed use. That's, if there's a hope to get that grocer under, the way I would see it going is, in a perfect world, you get grocer under kind of a boutique housing play that looks very kind of urban villagey. You're gonna have to do some surface parking, which is probably not how the site wants to present to the community, you know, this big sea of parking, because the grocers are gonna be the last people that come off their parking. I mean, they're, you know, they're in for 100 years, and when we have flying cars, they're still gonna be demanding 4 stalls per 1,000, just in case. So what we do is we kind of tuck their surface behind them, build out a, you know, kind of underground plaza area, so you're separating or bifurcating. The resident housing is not conflicting with the surface convenience parking. They go down, convenience stalls are right behind it, but it still presents to the street as this really cool kind of urban, you know, that site with our site with kind of a peek at the green that's up in the corner. And it presents really well, and I think that's we're trying to protect that central nice big spot, because all the stormwater is happening in a really good area. There's just that tiny little wetland on the corner. You know, we can work around that, see what happens on the other corner. But that's the piece that I think you guys are envisioning, and that's how it happens.
Can I ask a quick question about square footage? So
Yeah.
a boutique grocer, are you thinking like 30,000 square feet?
Like 20 to 25.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, prototypes vary a lot. It's probably not going to be the 12 to 14 variety. It's going to be the 25 plus or minus, and there's a couple hunting out there that are bigger small formats that are kind of pressing into the 40,000 square feet. I don't know if that'd be right here or not.
To put that in perspective, do you happen to have an idea of the square footage of the Kowalski's in Excelsior?
Not off the top of my head, but I think it's right in the range
really
we're
in that
talking
range.
about.
I think so.
Probably 25, 30.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's generally their
if
prototype.
that concept would go here, I mean, that would work.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
That it's that type of concept that works. It's not going to be, you know, Hy-Vee's urban small format or something like that. They're just
You don't have a ton of parking.
Excelsior, Kowalski's?
Yeah, Kowalski's there.
The stalls are like,
yeah, it's tricky out there.
But it's shared parking with some of the other stuff.
Although people run in and out, so you just
go
have
in
to
quick.
be patient.
Yeah.
yeah, that's right.
You're not there to.
They're
you're
not
there
long,
to-
they just
the
go in
prices
to
aren't
get
there
their
to stock
salmon
up.
cooked.
So what I would
I
say
think
is
in respect to that, we need to be careful. I mean, Isaac, hopefully you'll
We won't put any
have your
names in.
services to be able to keep track of all this, but anybody who's been to the Trader Joe's in St. Louis Park can see
yes.
there is a, grocer. There is also apartment building with underground parking for residents. There is street parking. Trying to buy food there is a nightmare because of the size of the parking lot they have. So
That was their first, and that fundamentally changed their business model. They will never do something like that again.
okay.
Yeah, it
It
was
has to be
never ready.
underparked.
Way underparked.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Massively.
It's like it's a thing within Trader Joe's how bad that site is. I mean, great site for them, but parking is horrendous. So my only point is, you guys are thinking about this exact right way, keeping flexibility, and that's kind of what we liked about the master plan and the way it laid out, is that we do phase and we get a little bit of a catalyst going, and then honestly kind of that prime, leaving some flexibility. The back ridge is not going to be retail, right? So I think that land use feels really good, some version of it, right? It doesn't have to be for sale, it doesn't have to be rental, it doesn't have to be walk-ups, it can be something kind of housing back there. I think it all makes sense, but that kind of inside the stagger realignment nucleus right there, maintaining as much flexibility and kind of riding the momentum with that is exactly the way to be looking at this.
And then, Chair, members of the commission, part of what I was trying to convey with the feasibility studies is to simply state we're netting out, staff feels very strongly that even through this scenario where there could be some shared use, residential use of parking, there's still a greater net positive of public parking spaces that will be seen within the downtown west site than there was going to be considered about 2.5, 3 years ago. So we feel very strongly, very confidently that it will not have a negative impact on future development throughout the site.
One other question I just thought of, does this site support additional infrastructure like Kraus Anderson has done underground? Like, is there anything that would prevent someone from doing a lot of underground as well on another
Like
building?
parking?
Yes.
No.
Okay.
Not to our knowledge of, we would assume that like all of the building sites are going to be pretty comparable. There's not like an aquifer 20 feet below the ground or anything, but it was anticipated, and I think it would still be strongly anticipated that underground parking serve the bulk of development outside of what's kind of shown on the surface here through this 2D layout. Absolutely.
So our objective is to keep this moving, obviously, and to make it happen. Do we have enough information to be able to do that?
Chair, members of the commission, I would defer to you all if you have questions.
This ordinance does require, or does allow for shared parking to be funded into the parking fund. That if the developer needs shared parking, it's still, they have to pay into the parking fund for their project, is from what I understand. So, I mean, it still defers them from wanting to get into the shared parking. I mean, the more shared parking needs they have to contribute to the parking fund.
Is that correct, Isaac?
Yeah, Chair, members of the commission,
Yeah,
the ordinance amendment in practice would facilitate the potential for requests for shared use of parking, which would then be determined how much is paid, what amount is paid, each on an individual basis based on the nature of the request. So that, you're absolutely correct. That's what it would
I
be.
mean, I'm just
Yeah.
looking at the ordinance, not getting into the development. We're not approving a development tonight, we're approving an ordinance, language change into that central business district. And once the developer approaches with the final plat or final, then you decide what the shared parking agreement is.
Yep.
And whether who's funding it or who isn't funding it. And from there, which would cause a developer to say, hey, you know, I don't want to have all my parking in shared parking, because then I got to pay into the parking fund. Which, I mean, they're confident that they have enough parking for their building, that really they don't, we're requiring them by the numbers to go to needing shared parking. So, I mean, in the ordinance, I feel confident that we're doing the right thing as far as the language in the ordinance. And moving forward, we'll decide how much gets shared and how much doesn't.
Well, and I think the existing ordinance, paying into the fund, I suspect as a developer, that may well be the path of the least expense. Is that a factual statement?
Yeah, I mean, it's expensive to build underground parking, very, very expensive these days. But that being said, it also, there is a majority tranche of community members that will rent at a building like this that will not leave their car on the street, especially in our seasons. So we kind of talked about this initially. It doesn't behoove us to underpark our own building, because it will result in vacancy, which is far supersedes any impact fee. From our perspective, you know, as I kind of look at it, we have the you know, our kind of pro rata share of the infrastructure assessment that we're going to be paying. We have, you know, different impact fees and dedication fees. We'll get a schedule of how all of these roll up, but I would rather have my building parked just right underground than pay additional impact fees to park. That's where I think there is alignment. Like, we don't want our operational folks having to manage your street parking. That's a bad, we have that in Sable, it's a bad situation. So I don't know if I answered the question or not. I'm just trying to give you my honest feedback.
I'm just saying, tonight we're here to approve the ordinance, not to approve your building.
Yeah, that'll come in a separate agreement.
In fact, Chair, members of the
Or
commission,
overnight parking.
It's already been.
Chair, members of the commission, staff is not engaged in like a negotiation or recommendation towards the developer to that end on cost or the precise structure of what a shared parking agreement would look like, simply because the ordinance does not permit that currently. So in order to do that and bring something forward, we would have to be able to facilitate that first, if that makes any sense. Kind of a chicken and the egg thing, where we don't want to get over our skis or out of bounds without going through the process, which is why we're here tonight.
I think Commissioner Kuhn, he draws an important distinction that the issue before us is an ordinance modification. And among the three proposals that are put before us, the first option, subject to the available shared parking, is the one that drives the most amount of spaces that a developer would have to provide for a project. So if there are no available shared parking, then that first option creates the largest number of spaces that would be then required to get the project done. Whereas the other options would size that back down. So then, now, you know, Mr. Gregory brings up a perfect point in that there are levers that can be used against this shared parking and bringing it down, bring the available number down, i.e. you restrict overnight parking in this district. Now you've taken a big bunch of inventory off the table, at least from a practical standpoint, but it would still meet the availability. The other thing is that in the shared green space, the city could just simply say, we won't make any of that available to developers, period. That'll be just simply 9 to 5, no overnight parking, no shared parking, take that off the inventory of available parking spaces. And then future development would have to create its own spaces to meet that requirement. So, bringing it full circle, the first option maximizes the amount of parking available that would have to be generated in a project. So, I'm supportive of the staff's recommendation that that is the option of the three that we've talked about over the past several weeks that drives that objective. And I think the objective is that we don't want to just run the well dry on parking spaces.
Mm-hmm. We're thinking long-term.
Mhm. Yeah, and there is a level of compromise, certainly, in order to accomplish this at the same time. Terry, any other thoughts on this?
No, again, I think this is a very nice building, more than 3 years in the making, and who knows how long it takes to build it once it's fully approved. But if we don't get going here, then nobody else is going to come into that space. So I'm not trying to force the issue, but they've worked hard on this. The developer, the city, I hate to lose it over a few parking spaces, I guess is my view.
So that would seem to indicate you're ready to make a motion.
One prop's on the screen here. Sure. I recommend the City Council approve the proposed ordinance amendments to the City of Victoria Zoning Code, Section 20, off-street parking and loading as presented and discussed.
A second.
Very good. Those in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed?
Opposed.
Opposed? Okay. One opposed and 6 in favor? Let the record reflect that. Very good. Thank you very much. The motion does carry. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Appreciate it. We knew that we would get to this point, but quite frankly, there's a lot of detail that it just truly has to happen. And as has been said, it's for the long term. And it has to be done right. So, very good. Moving on to the miscellaneous section of our agenda. We have a number of different things. I'm going to quote from the Victoria Gazette. And she said, thank you, Greg, thank you, Alvin, thank you, Andy, for stepping up to the plate on behalf of the citizens of Victoria and be willing to serve. It is a very generous thing to do. And that would be relative to Greg's running for city council.
Thank you, Chair. I think that the Gazette points it out that there's 2 open council seats. There's 3 candidates. I have chosen to file for an affidavit for candidacy, and I think we all have the citizens of Victoria will have a difficult choice to make among 3 qualified candidates, and at the end of the day, they should make their decision based on who they feel is the best qualified to lead our city.
Very good. It is that basic, isn't it? Representative government, no doubt about it. City council report.
Oh, I have that. From 8/22/2022 council meeting, started off with the Pledge of Allegiance, of course. Then there was an announcement regarding the fact that there is a parking data workshop on 9/26. Folk Fest is on 9/10. There's also a Nordic Fest on 9/10 in Lions Park. No public comments. Consent agenda was approved, and then they approved the purchase agreement for the future fire department, which is the southwest corner of Cochia and 82nd. Is that right?
Yep.
82nd, yep.
I still don't see how they have enough space there, but that's not my problem. It's all approved. I don't remember it coming before this committee, so it was one of the days I was probably at soccer. But they're looking at November 30th as a close date, design done by the end of 2023, and construction starting on 2025. Other notes on that, there were some options about building around the water tower. Again, 6 acres, $664,000. Then last but not least, they talked about downtown west phase 1 public infrastructure and getting all of that started for $158,000. Nobody had any comments, and everyone voted to initiate it. And then they adjourned.
Can I ask a quick question?
Questions?
Yeah, so the fire station at Cochise and 82nd, Planning Commission hasn't had any discussions on this design and any of the specifics. Is there a reason?
Chair, members of the commission, so the item that's been before the council is simply the negotiation and purchase of the property.
Okay.
The land is guided institutionally, and it's zoned appropriately to be a fire station. We're still a ways out down the line from when like a build date would be, but really probably the most, there would be a minor subdivision, not a plat. If we get to the finish line, that the planning commission would hear, and then the site plan proposal for what the fire station is when we get to that point. But no, we haven't gotten to that point yet, and we're probably at least a couple years out.
Oh, gosh. Okay.
Won't it be confusing to have a fire station at the home of the fire? The
Yeah,
Holy
it's
Family
also
Fire?
sitting right on top of a
The Holy Family
gas
Fire, aren't they
line,
called the
too.
fire?
Yes, they are. I think that's a gas line that pumps right through there. You know, I guess it's a perfect spot to have a fire department if there's an issue.
Quick response.
Yeah.
But they did make some comments regarding the fact that they looked at a bunch of different locations, and this one was the one that stuck out as the best option. They did look for more options south and west, where a lot of the new home development's going on, but didn't find anything appropriate. Probably due to cost, but that would just be my editorial comment. Anything else?
And the meeting was adjourned.
This is a lesson.
So I would also like to quote our esteemed city planner, Isaac Peterson, about always having your planning commission cap on. And you know, I mean, that really is a good point. And it was part of a conversation, and it was relative to our trip to Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And then you know, we've been in downtown Excelsior once a month, maybe more, and never really paid a lot of attention. But when you start looking at what's going on and you approach it from a little different angle, there's potentially a lot to be learned from observing on that. Staff, anything additional?
Nothing major, Mr. Chair. I would concur, and I would invite all of you, as you're walking around the built world and you see things that you like, snap a picture and send it to city staff, and just let us know what you're seeing, what you like, if you have questions about something. I know me and Jen have our own Pinterest boards and collages of urban environments, and I think it's a great exercise to kind of undertake and look at. But nothing else from me, Mr. Chair.
My sources told me that you have a joke also.
Oh, my joke. I didn't get to use it. I was going to say at the beginning of our discussion item that we had at least until midnight to make a recommendation. So a few hours left.
And we made that. We made that in real good shape. Commissioners, any other thoughts on anything?
I'm kind of curious about future agendas that we're going to be seeing. Is there anything that's going to be on the docket for the next planning commission pertaining to the proposed Monarch development?
Great question, Commissioner Moore, Chair, members of the commission. Where we're at, we're still in the both data-driven analysis of trying to get some updated parking counts in the central business district and bringing that all together. Commissioner Pedersen noted that there'll be a work session. We're intending over the next 2 months here, probably won't be before the end of the month, but holding kind of a separate discussion item about those parking counts that were being evaluated, and then having more general conversation about parking. But yes, if the Gannon project is brought forward, the commission, of course, would see that. We just don't have a firm date yet.
Do you know when the study will be completed?
Commissioner Moore, Chair, members of the commission, there isn't a full study that's being undertaken right now. The city has received some updated parking counts just from the central business area that we're looking at and planning on bringing forward here.
So you're not going to do a study?
Commissioner Moore, Chair, members of the commission, staff's intent was to first collect the counts and then receive feedback on
I see.
where to take it from there.
I see. Okay.
Not that we don't
Process.
like doing parking studies,
Okay.
but
Thank you.
just a temperature check, and then where do we go from here?
How's the hometown bank project?
Great question, Commissioner Kuhn, Chair, members of the commission. Over the last 6 months or so, we've been looking at the transportation element of that proposal, namely what the impact of a potential roundabout would be at that intersection along Highway 5, and if that layout would feasibly work. So we haven't received a formal application or anything to that end, but as we've kind of advanced through the traffic study part of that, we're going to be engaging, staff will be engaging with neighboring property owners here over the course of the next few weeks, and having kind of a broader outreach campaign prior to bringing something formal forward. But that would be the kind of phase 2 check-in of that traffic study that was approved by the city council. Has just been wrapped up here, so we're going to be representing that, or City Engineer Guerin would be presenting that to the City Council upcoming, and going from there on where do we want to take this.
Isn't that dependent on the state of Minnesota putting one of the Big Daddy roundabouts in right there? Because I thought we had rejected, or the thought of a right turn only in was rejected.
Yeah, Commissioner Pedersen, Chair, members of the commission, it would be part of what would inform that decision, of course, is the cost of what a roundabout would be there. The state's, periodically, it's not within the Arboretum area transportation plan, so there isn't a readily available source of funding that something could be applied to. So in order for there to be state funding, the location of the roundabout through the traffic study that's underway would have to be readopted into the Arboretum area transportation plan. There'd have to be community engagement to talk about it beforehand. But yes, it would likely have to have some form of state funding.
Gotcha. So we just pay for the study at this point, and then
And the developer is.
And hopefully, the state would then readopt the Arboretum plan to include a roundabout in that spot.
Correct.
That's kind of what I thought. Could I ask one question? What about the gun range? Has that kind of died on the vine? All right.
Chair, members of the commission, at a former community that I worked at, we used to call this part of the meeting "Stump the Planner," which is great. But Commissioner Pedersen, we have engaged in no kind of further work since the last round of conversation that we've talked about. The signaling has been that there's limited, broader funding available for such a project, so it hasn't advanced further than that to date.
Thank you.
Anything else? We still have until what, 11:30? So.
Keep it coming.
Plenty of time. Come on. Anything else? One other item that I'd like to go over one more time is to congratulate Greg on stepping up to the plate, and look forward to the first week in November. So, very good.
You promised to cut our taxes in half. What's your campaign promise?
Simply applaud.
Not the appropriate venue for me to comment on that this evening.
Okay, just curious.
Hearing nothing else,
Commissioner
I will
Fording.
look for a motion to adjourn.
Make a motion to adjourn.
Is there a second? Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. We are adjourned. Thank you.
You're not opposing this one.